Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Maaser, Sheni. We are up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Chet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'enu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbai ben Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. In yesterday's Mishnah, we discussed chambers built into the walls of Yerushalayim. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss chambers built in and around the temple courtyard known as the Azara. The temple courtyard had a more sanctified status than the temple mount that surrounded it, the Harabayit. And the Mefarshim explained, for example, certain types of korbanot, those known as Kodshe Kodashim, which is most holy offerings, like a Chatat or an Asham offering, they may be eaten only in the courtyard and not in the rest of the Harabayit, the temple mount. And in addition, a person who enters the courtyard while Tameh is punished with Karet. So the Mishnah today is going to discuss the status of chambers that are located partly in the courtyard and partly on the Harabayit, the temple mount. Halishachot, the halakha for the chambers of the temple courtyard is as follows. Binuyot bakodesh uftuchot nachol. Chambers that are built in the sanctified area, which is the courtyard, but they open into the unsanctified area, which is the rest of the temple mount. And the Mefarshim explained, the Rav says, these chambers were built at the edge of the sanctified courtyard area. The interior of the chamber was located within the courtyard, but the entrance was outside the courtyard in the unsanctified area of the Temple Mount Harabayit. Now, although the whole Temple Mount Harabayit is sanctified to a certain degree, the reason the Mishnah is referring to it as unsanctified is because it is less holy in comparison to the Azara, the courtyard. So the Mishnah says, Tochan Chol, their interior spaces are not sanctified, because the sanctity of the chamber's interior is determined by where its entrance is, and these do not open into the courtyard. And this halakha we learn from a pasuk in the Torah. It's brought down in Masechet Zvachim, page 56a. Vegagoten kodesh, but the chamber's roofs are sanctified, because the sanctity of a roof depends on where it actually is, and these roofs are located inside the courtyard. And the Mefarshim explain, the Mishnah is referring to roofs that are level with the floor of the courtyard, because since the Harabayit was a hill, it's possible for a chamber to be hollowed out of the ground beneath the courtyard, so that it opened onto the side of the hill, but its roof was at the level of the courtyard floor. So the Rav says such roofs are considered part of the courtyard and are sanctified, because the Mefarshim explain, a roof that is higher than the floor of the courtyard has no sanctity, because the upper floors and the roofs of the temple rooms have no sanctity. The whole Mishnah's case was referring to where it's ground level with the courtyard, with the Azara. If it were to be higher than the floor of the courtyard, it would have no sanctity, because the upper floors and roofs of the temple rooms have no sanctity, as the Rab says. Binuyot bachol uftuchot lakodesh. Chambers, however, that are built in the unsanctified area, meaning outside the courtyard, but they open into the sanctified area, which is the courtyard. Tochan kodesh, their interiors are sanctified, because their entrances are located in the courtyard. Vegagoten chol, but their roofs are not sanctified, because the roofs are located outside of the courtyard. Binuyot bakodesh ubachol, chambers that are built in both the sanctified and unsanctified areas, meaning they extend through the walls of the courtyard, so that part of the chamber is inside and part is outside. Uftuchot lakodesh velachol, and they open into both the sanctified and unsanctified areas, because they have entrances on both sides. Tochan vegagotehen mikeneged hakodesh velakodesh kodesh. The halakha is the same for both the interior and the roof. Mikeneged hakodesh velakodesh kodesh. The section of the chamber located from the sanctified area and inwards towards the sanctified area, meaning the part that is in the courtyard, is sanctified. Mikeneged hachol vilachol chol. The section of the chamber located from the unsanctified area and outward towards the unsanctified area, meaning the part that is not in the courtyard, is not sanctified. And the Mefarshim explain, since these chambers open to both sanctified and unsanctified areas, their sanctity is not determined by their openings, but by the ground upon which they are built. Therefore, the halakha is the same for the interiors and the roofs. The sections built on sanctified land are sanctified. those built on unsanctified land are not sanctified. And like in the previous case, the roofs are sanctified only if they are at the ground level of the courtyard. If they are higher than ground level, even the section of the roof that covers the sanctified area is not sanctified. Like we said, the Rav writes, a roof that is higher than the floor of the courtyard has no sanctity, because the upper floors and the roofs of the temple rooms have no sanctity. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Chet. Mishnah Tet now deals with, we learned that once Maaser Sheni produce enters the city of Yerushalayim, we said the way we said it in the Hebrew, let me just find it. We said Mechitzot Koltot, the walls take hold, meaning we said once Maaser Sheni produce enters the city, the walls of Yerushalayim take hold of it, and it may not be removed from the city or redeemed. So the Mishnah now discusses an exception to that rule. Maaser Sheni that became Tameh. If Maaser Sheni becomes Tameh in any way, it may not be eaten, it may be redeemed even within the walls of Yerushalayim. And the Mefarshim explain, we learned this halakha from a pasuk in Dvarim, chapter 14, pasuk 24. After the Maaser Sheni is redeemed, it loses its sanctity and becomes churin, which may be eaten, even though it is tameh. The Mishnah now quotes a machloket about whether tameh Maaser Sheni may be redeemed from the city. May be removed from the city after it is redeemed. Maaser Sheni shenichnas Yerushalayim v'nitma. If Maaser Sheni produce entered Yerushalayim and became tameh, ben shenitma be'avatuma, whether it became tameh from a contact with an avatuma, primary source of tuma, which makes it biblically tameh. Mefarshim explain avatuma refers to something that creates tuma. An example would be a sheretz, which is a carcass of one of the 8 creeping animals listed in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 11, psukim 29 to 30, and a nevilah, which is the carcass of an animal that died without being properly slaughtered. Any person, utensil, or food, including Maaser Sheni, that is touched by an avatuma becomes tameh under biblical law. So whether it's an avatuma, ben shenitma bivlada tuma, or whether it became tameh from contact with the secondary source of tuma that makes it tameh only midrabanan by rabbinic law. And the Mefarshim explain a secondary source of tuma, what we call vlada tuma, is a category that refers to anything that becomes tameh from an avatuma. Some secondary sources of tuma are tameh under biblical law, and some are tameh only under rabbinic law. The Rav says our Mishnah is referring to items that are tameh under rabbinic law. An example would be a utensil that touched tameh liquid. The Mishnah says ben bifnim, ben bachutz, whether it became tameh inside of Yerushalayim or outside of Yerushalayim, meaning whether the Maaser Sheni became tameh after being brought into Yerushalayim, or whether it became tameh while still outside Yerushalayim and then was brought into the city. Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai say, Yipadeh v'yachel hakol bifnim. In all of these cases, the Maaser Sheni should be redeemed even though it is still inside Yerushalayim, but it must be eaten inside the city. Now, although this produce is not chulin because you redeemed it and it should really be permitted to be taken out, the rabbis decreed that it remains forbidden to be removed from the city out of a concern that if it would be removed, people who are not aware that it became tameh might see it being taken out of the city and think that it's permitted to remove all Maaser Sheni from Yerushalayim. And the Rav explains, however, he may redeem the Maaser Sheni without concern of what people will think, because redeeming is generally done privately and other people will not find out about it. Chutz mishenitma be'avatuma b'chutz. An exception is Maaser Sheni that became tameh from an avatuma outside of Yerushalayim. In that case, it may be removed from the city and redeemed and eaten outside, because there is no concern that people will see it taken out and draw the wrong conclusion. Because when Maaser Sheni that is so severely tameh from an avatuma enters Yerushalayim, that fact is widely known, and everyone will know that this Maaser Sheni is being removed from Yerushalayim because it is tameh. That's how the Mefarshim explain it. ובית הלל אומרים, but Bet Hillel say, הכל ייפדה ויאכל בחוץ. In all these cases, the Maaser Sheni may be redeemed and eaten even outside Yerushalayim, because Bet Hillel do not share Bet Shammai's concern that people will mistakenly think that Maaser Sheni may be removed from Yerushalayim. Therefore, there is no reason to forbid removing the produce from Yerushalayim after it has been redeemed and is no longer sanctified. Chutz mishenitma bivlad tuma bifnim. An exception though is Maaser Sheni that became tameh from a secondary tuma inside Yerushalayim. In that case, it may not be removed from the city, because here there's another concern. Since the Maaser Sheni entered Yerushalayim when it was tahor, that we said mechitzot koltot, the walls took hold of it and forbade its removal from Yerushalayim. That hold was never released, and therefore the produce may not be taken out, even though it became tameh. The Mefarshim explain, like we learned, when Maaser Sheni enters Yerushalayim, the walls of Yerushalayim take hold, mechitzot koltot, they take hold of it, and it becomes forbidden to be taken out of the city. That hold remains a concern in one of the Mishnah's 4 cases where the produce became tameh from a secondary tumah inside Yerushalayim. So it's not a concern in any other cases, as follows. If the produce became tameh from an avatuma outside Yerushalayim, the walls never take hold of it at all, since they do not take hold of Maaser Sheni that is unfit to eat. And if it becomes tameh from an avatuma while in Yerushalayim, even though the walls took hold of it when it entered the city, this hold is released when it becomes unfit to eat. However, when it becomes tameh inside Yerushalayim from a secondary tumah, the walls took hold of it when it entered, since it was tahor at that time, and since it became tameh only midrabanan by rabbinic law, and is therefore still tahor and fit to be eaten midoraita by Torah law, the walls do not release their hold, and therefore Bet Hillel rule that in this case, when it was brought impure and it became tameh by a secondary source inside of Yerushalayim, the produce may not be removed from the city. As for the 4th case, produce that became tameh outside Yerushalayim from a secondary tumah, in truth, really, the hold of the walls should still apply, because although the walls do not take hold of Maaser Sheni that is unfit to eat, this Maaser Sheni is tameh only midrabanan on a rabbinic level, and really min Torah it's tahor and fit to eat. Therefore, the walls should really take hold of it when it enters the city and forbid its removal. But Bet Hillel, who said that such produce may be taken out of Yerushalayim, referred to a case where the owner brought the Maaser Sheni into Yerushalayim. The Yerushalmi says he made a stipulation that the walls should not take hold of it. So in this case, the rabbis say they relax the walls' hold and the produce can be removed from the city. So in the summary, in conclusion, the Mishnah presents us 4 cases. Maaser Sheni became tameh from an avatuma while outside Yerushalayim, from an avatuma inside Yerushalayim, from a secondary tuma outside of Yerushalayim, and from a secondary tuma inside Yerushalayim. Bet Shammai ruled that in the case number 3 and 4, if it became tameh from an avatuma inside, or from a secondary tuma outside, and the final case from a secondary tuma inside, the Maaser Sheni must be redeemed and eaten in Yerushalayim. But in the case of an avat tumah while outside, it may be redeemed and eaten anywhere. Bet Hillel rule that in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd case, avat tumah while outside, avat tumah inside, and secondary tumah outside, the Maaser Sheni can be redeemed and eaten even outside of Yerushalayim. But in case C, it only applies when the owner brought it into the city, he made the stipulation that he wants to remove it. And in case D, from a secondary tumah inside, they hold it must be redeemed and eaten inside of Yerushalayim. Again, I recommend looking at it inside, maybe writing it out so you could see 4 cases when it applies to Bet Hillel and when it applies to Bet Shammai. That is in Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.